industrial period. And highlighted here is the key dates of this period that you need to know for your exam. So we're looking between 1750 and 1900. In session, you should have been given this do now, and you will have gone through this with the teacher, so I'm not going to go through that now. So moving on quickly to the daily learning target. I can describe how the characteristics of industrial Britain would have affected health. What we mean by characteristics is the beliefs and attitudes and what was happening at the time and how that effectively would have affected health. So let's look at the characteristics of industrial Britain then. Let's look at the first one on your sheet, which is entitled Food Supply. I'm going to read through some information, but I want you to make sure that you have this information down on your sheet, the 3 key bullet points. So let's have a look at food supply, a characteristic of industrial Britain. So after 1750, the start of this period, Britain's population rocketed from around 6 million and it grew to 21 million in 1850, and by 1900 it actually reached 37 million, which is a massive increase of population. Improvements in agriculture, like the introduction of the new machinery, meant that Britain's growing population did not starve. So as you can see here, we've got new machinery. As a result of this, it meant farming was much easier. However, the wages of the labouring families, the labouring poor, were too low to provide an adequate diet. So the diet wasn't good enough. For example, George Mitchell, who was brought up in a labouring family in Somerset during the 1830s, was sometimes so hungry that he had to eat turnips from the fields or collected snails to roast for his tea, which is why the snail's here. In cities, poorer people found it difficult to find fresh and safe food. Sometimes all they could afford to buy from the butcher was cheap cuts of meat from diseased animals. So let's summarise that then. We've got an increase in population, more people to feed. Yes, we've got machinery, which is able to provide that food. However, people still couldn't afford it. They were eating things like snails and diseased meat. So make sure you've got that down on your sheet. Moving on to number 2, industrialisation. And you've looked at that key word in your do now. We're going to have a look. In the period of 1750, so the first half of this period, to 1850, industrialisation transformed Britain. That means it radically changed Britain. The first textile mills were powered by water, but the early 19th century steam engines had improved to the point where it could be used to power machinery. The demand for coal increased, new mines opened, and canals were built to transport the coal to the factories. In Manchester and in other industrial cities, hundreds of factory chimneys belched out smoke, creating a thick smog over the streets. As Britain's towns and cities expanded, more and more people also used cheap coal in their houses. The smoke from the chimney pots added to the air pollution from the factories. In London, the fumes from hundreds of breweries, potteries and glassmakers and other manufacturers combined with the smoke from houses to create a thick pea-soup fogs. So let's just summarise that then. We're using more coal. We've got steam engines to power machinery. We've got hundreds of factories and different manufacturers pumping out smoke into the atmosphere, creating this big, black, thick smoke. And that would have negatively impacted health because we would have been breathing this in. So it's really important that you've got those different bullet points down and that you understand that this is a period of industrialisation, a period of moving from the rural areas into the cities and building factories to mass produce items. So let's move on to number 3 then, working conditions. And you will have come across this before in previous expeditions, but we're just going to have a quick look at working conditions. So this picture, this one here, from 1835, shows the interior of a textile mill in the north of England. The picture portrays a textile factory in a very positive light. The sun shines in through the windows, which you can see here. The female worker looked well dressed, clean and healthy. But actually, this is not the reality of factory work. It was actually quite different. In the early 19th century, children working in Manchester factories started at 5 a.m. and had a half an hour for their breakfast and half an hour for their lunch and finished work at 6 p.m. Hour after hour, they breathed in dusty air of the factory. The noise from the machinery was deafening and accidents were common. So here you can see the children working and he's not even wearing any shoes. So we need to know that in the industrial period, working conditions in the factories was really poor, okay, and a lot of people were injured. They're breathing in dusty air. It's affecting their breathing in terms of their health and their respiratory health, and they're also listening to the machines. They've not got noise, ear defenders or anything to protect them from that noise. So working conditions were particularly difficult at the time. So make sure you've got those 3 bullet points down. Right, number 4 then, the British Empire. Okay, so in 1750, right at the beginning of this period, Britain was already an important trading nation with colonies in America and in the West Indies. The American colonies became independent in 1783, but Britain's empire continued to grow in other parts of the world, particularly in India. The map shows the extent of the British Empire in 1886. By the end of the 19th century, much of Africa was also under British control. In 1900, Britain ruled 1/5 of the world's land and 1/4 of the world's population. And this is important because the huge growth in trade that came from this. So it brought new plants, animals, foods and ideas, and it also brought new diseases to Britain. Okay, so Britain was so powerful at the time, and as you can see from the map, it shows the extent of the empire at the time, which meant that they were able to get hold of more goods. Right, number 5. Urbanisation and the railways. Rapid growth of urban areas, living conditions varied, but there were huge pressures on water, waste and housing. So we've got the rapid growth, people migrating to the cities. So that meant people needed more water, they needed somewhere to put their waste, and they needed somewhere to live. So that's what we call urbanisation, moving from rural areas to urban areas. So by 1850, a network of railways connected major urban areas. So they used the railways to bring fresh food, and allowed people to escape to rural areas and the coast. However, okay, as we've already spoken about, the trains also added to the air pollution, so that negatively affected health. Right, this is really important one. So this is the changing beliefs of the time. Okay, so in the period 1750 to 1900, many people were influenced by new scientific thinking, which challenged religious views. So in 1859, the man in this photograph that you might recognise is Charles Darwin. He published his book on evolution, the origin of the species. Darwin's theory of evolution challenged the story of creation found in the Bible. It led to a huge shift in the way people understood the world. By the end of the 19th century, many people in Britain believed that science had disproved Christianity. For centuries, religion governed people's view of the world, but by 1900, right at the end of this period, it was becoming a secular society. And if you remember, we talked about the word secular at the beginning of this lesson. That means a society without religion. So we've got a huge change in beliefs. We've got an influence of science, okay, and a lot of discovery around science. Right, number 7. So new discoveries, and this is really important, okay, particularly for this module where you're looking at health. So the man looking through the microscope in this painting is the French scientist Louis Pasteur. In 1861, Pasteur made one of the most important discoveries in human history ever, that he found out that harmful germs could enter the body, grow fast and cause disease. In the late 19th century, other scientists built on his work by identifying germs which caused specific diseases. At last, in 1861, the true cause of human disease had been discovered. This is pivotal. This is pivotal. This is a turning point in history. This is really important new discovery that you need to know for your exams. 1861, we discover that finally that germs cause disease. So, number 8, growing literacy. Okay? So, in 1750, few children in Britain went to school. But in the late 18th century, charities and churches began to provide schools for poorer children. During the 19th century, the government also began to get involved in education, and towards the end of the industrial period in 1870, an Education Act provides schools for all children under the age of 10. Improvements in education meant that more people could read, and this fueled a growth in the demand for newspapers. Daily and weekly newspapers began to play an important part in people's lives as more and more people enjoyed reading about sporting events, crimes, politics, and other matters. By the end of the century, many newspapers were illustrated and contained advertisements, that people could read and learn about. This massively improved health because they're able to learn about how to support themselves if they have a particular disease or illness. So, number 9, the growth of democracy. Okay, so until 1832, only 5% of the population could vote in the election for the House of Commons, and no women were allowed to vote. Few of Britain's new industrial cities were represented by their own members of Parliament. Change came in 1832 Reform Act, which gave the vote to men who owned a property and allowed the larger towns to have 2 MPs each. In 1867 and 1884, the vote was extended to working class men. During the 19th century, national and local government began to play a bigger part in people's lives. By the end of the century, it had become quite normal for the government to pass laws which tried to improve the lives of poorer people. So let's summarise. At the beginning, of this period, only 5% could vote. By the end of this period, now working class men have the chance to vote. And because they have a chance to vote, more laws were being passed to improve the lives of working class people. So we've got a massive growth in democracy and also a representation of the poor in terms of voting and having their viewpoint put across. So last 2 then. The last one is class divisions. So let's summarise this quickly. The wealthy and the poor generally didn't mix in society. And if you remember, you actually did this source in a previous year where we've got the difference between the workers in a factory and the wealthy factory owner. So factory owners and professional people moved out the centres of industrial towns and cities where the environment was better. So if you had money, people were starting to move out to rural areas now to live in bigger houses and have more fresh air. The working class lived in slums, so the poor lived in really poor housing where they lived on top of each other with numerous people in one room. Most of the wealthy did not associate, so there was a big class divide. They ignored the struggles, which you can see here, and they didn't really care about them or their living conditions. That started to change towards the end of the period, but for the majority of the industrial period, the wealthy lived a much better life. Okay, last but not least, then we go back to alcohol again. So people in the industrial period still drank too much. Alcohol was still a problem through the entirety of the industrial period, but the middle class enjoyed a bottle of wine and many men enjoyed brandy or port, so we're starting to get a difference in alcohol. Working class people also drank too much alcohol, but now we're drinking it in a pub rather than drinking it at home. Drunkenness was still a problem even after the gin craze, and a temperance movement was set up to persuade people to stop drinking alcohol. So alcohol still is an issue, and particularly for the working class, so that's something that has stayed the same. So on your sheet now, You're going to pause this video and you should have notes for every different characteristic of the industrial period. And what you're going to do now is think about, how does this characteristic affect people's health? So how did the food supply affect people's health? So I've given you an example here, and I've put, the rapid increase in population would have led to more cramped living conditions in towns and cities. As a result of this, diseases such as typhus, passed on by body lice, would have been more common. Although machines were invented, many could not afford a varied or nutritious food, therefore their diet would be poor, i.e. they'd eat things like potatoes and bread, leading to malnutrition and a weakened immune system. So you need to be specific about how it would affect the public's health, okay, for each of the characteristics in turn. So I'll leave that example on the board for you.